we will together object to certification in order to force the appointment of an emergency electoral commission to perform an emergency audit of the election results to assess these claims of frauds. I think we can do that. We can do it promptly. We can do it in 10 days before the inauguration.
Less than 2 weeks before the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden, Republicans in Congress make one final attempt to derail his election victory. Hello and Happy New Year. Welcome to our first Inside America of 2021 with me, Rida Fakhri. A small group of Republican senators led by Texas Senator Ted Cruz have objected to President-elect Joe Biden's Electoral College victory during a joint session of Congress to certify the result of the 2020 election. They argue Congress should establish an electoral commission to audit election results and address claims of voter fraud. As many as 140 Republican House members also challenged Biden's victory. This has sparked an open conflict among Republican lawmakers, with Senator Mitt Romney calling it, quote, an egregious ploy that dangerously threatens our democratic republic, and former House Speaker Paul Ryan saying that it is, quote, difficult to conceive of a more anti-democratic act. Other Republicans shared similar concerns.
This will start a terrible cycle where every election must be objected to, and eventually, we will lose our ability to self-govern. It really is that serious.
Meanwhile, in a letter published by the Washington Post, all 10 living former secretaries of defense declared the election over and warned that, quote, efforts to involve the U.S. armed forces in resolving election disputes would take us into dangerous, unlawful, and unconstitutional territory. So where does this last-ditch effort by Trump's allies on Capitol Hill to overturn the election result leave Republicans and the future of their party? I'm joined by former Republican Congressman Jack Kingston. He is chairman of the Georgia Republican Party Foundation and served as an advisor to the 2020 Trump campaign. Congressman Kingston, Republicans have been desperately trying to hold on to their slim majority in the Senate by winning two crucial runoff elections in your home state, Georgia. What they needed was a unifying message. Yet the party has become bitterly divided. There is open warfare among its representatives on Capitol Hill in what is looking like a loyalty test to the president. It doesn't bode very well, does it, for the future of the Republican Party?
Well, I think the division has been the Trump enthusiasts versus people who say, well, there's a party beyond Trump, but frequently the dominant personality in the White House becomes the party, and yet individual representatives with individual districts have philosophies that brought them to Washington using a different route than somebody across the country. And so it's part of the process. It's not unique to Republicans.
But this is different, though, Congressman. We've never seen anything like it. When you have so many Republican House members and a group of influential senators objecting to the result of a free and fair election and trying to overturn the will of the American people, what does it say about your party?
We have had these kind of debates in the past. That's what the Constitution is set up for. What Ted Cruz is trying to do is set up a system where you would have a review of the elections, 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, 5 members of the Supreme Court that would look at some of these allegations. I know, for example, in our state of Georgia, we have over 200 investigations that are going on about dead people voting, people who voted who weren't properly registered to vote. And then there's the other discussions about signature matching and the fact that, for example, in Georgia, we usually have about a 3% error rate of ballots that were thrown out, with a much lower number of absentee ballots. But in November, we had a tremendous increase in absentee ballots, and yet the error rate went down. Well, that doesn't make sense.
Congressman, there's always going to be these sorts of allegations of fraud and irregularities in any election. But what has happened here is that these allegations have been investigated. They've been disproved at the state level. All 50 states have certified the election results. There were recounts and audits, 3 of them in your home state. Dozens of federal and state judges have dismissed the lawsuits that were brought before them. So has the Supreme Court. You say Democrats have done it in the past, but the difference in the past is that the nominee has disavowed these efforts to object to the election results. And all 50 states this time have certified them. Hasn't the time come for moving on? Hasn't the time for questioning the election result passed?
Well, first of all, in my home state, Stacey Abrams has never conceded that she lost the gubernatorial election 2 years ago. Joe Biden himself, certainly Hillary Clinton, and Jimmy Carter said that Donald Trump was an illegitimate president. So we have been moving towards I'd say a divided country for many years now, not just this election cycle. But I think that what the members of Congress are trying to do is respond to their constituents. 39%, I think it's 39% of the American people think that the election was rigged. And the number for Republicans is in the high 60s, but the number of the Democrat Party is 20% or so. So these are pretty significant numbers.
But these are not the results of the election, though. The majority of American people spoke, and there was a landslide for Joe Biden in the Electoral College result, 306 against 232 votes. 81 million Americans voted for Biden, 74 million for Trump. I mean, there's a clear winner here, isn't there?
Well, I think that what we're concerned about is we heard that the Russian hoax was reality. We heard all kinds of things from high tech and a biased media for years. And I think the Republican Party is saying, hey, we're going to take a look at this. And if there is no fraud, then what is the Democrat Party afraid of? I know in the state
But they've taken a look at this, and you've got states in which you have Republican governors and secretaries of state who certify the result. Can you deny that Biden is the president-elect and that he won this election? Yes or no?
Well, no, I think once we go through the process this week and make sure that these votes are all certified, then that becomes the reality. Just as the Democrats did to George Bush and to Donald Trump, the Republicans are saying we're going to have this debate. And I think that's what it's about. But unlike the Democrats, we don't have Antifa. We don't have groups going to the street and burning down buildings and yelling and screaming about the injustice. We're going to do this peacefully. We're going to do it through the court system. But the Constitution set up.
Well, Congressman, you have right-wing extremists and militias who are getting ready to go onto the streets. In the lead up to the inauguration, you and other Republicans have been describing Democrats as radical, but many accuse people in the Republican Party, like Senator Ted Cruz, whom you endorsed for president in 2016, and other Republican lawmakers, of being the true radicals, of trying to subvert democracy. In a joint statement, Cruz and others argued that, quote, that deep distrust of our democratic processes will not magically disappear. It should concern us all, and it poses an ongoing threat to the legitimacy of any subsequent administrations. But the question is, Congressman, isn't the real concern that some senators like Josh Hawley, like Ted Cruz, are putting their political ambitions ahead of anything else? They're trying to hold on to and appeal to Trump's 74 million voters.
I think what they're doing is using the rights that are given to them as senators through the United States Constitution to make sure that this election was fair. But to say that their actions are on any plane close to Antifa, which is a violent, anti-American, anti-police group, is ridiculous. We do not have those kind of violent protesters in the Republican Party. You can find a small fraction of maybe right-wing groups, but they're nothing compared to the left-wing organizational groups that we have seen marching in the streets for 4 years under Donald Trump.
But the party is drifting further and further to the right. Where does it leave moderate Republicans?
I think if you look at what happened in the state of Georgia, aside from the presidential election, Republicans have done real well. If you look at the U.S. Congress, we did not lose one incumbent in the U.S. House. So the Republican Party is doing a heck of a lot better under Donald Trump than the Democrat Party did under Barack Obama. The Democrat Party lost over 1,000 office holders on state and federal levels under Barack Obama. So, and if you look at the division...
But aren't Republicans, though, being driven by fears of retaliation in the next elections if they do not help Trump overturn this election?
Well, let's if you want to look at division in a party. Nancy Pelosi barely has gotten reelected as Speaker. She had 5 to 7 members of her own party who would not vote for her. The radical left, led by socialist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, are pushing mainstream Democrats. Many of them are gone now because they lost their elections in November. It's the radical left that has pulled them down. Joe Biden's scared to death of them. He's having to pander to them already. And I think once the American people start seeing more of the left-wing agenda, then the Republican Party is going to regain the House and make great strides in the next election.
All right, former Congressman Jack Kingston, good to have you with us. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Now, the state of Georgia continues to be front and center with 2 crucial Senate runoff races that could tilt the balance of power in the upper house of Congress, with Republicans currently holding a 50-48 majority. But just days ahead of the vote, the Washington Post released a leaked recording of a conversation between President Trump and Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who certified Joe Biden's electoral victory in his state for the 3rd time last month following recounts.
And the people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
The president's plea for intervention to overturn the result of the election in the state raises questions about whether Trump violated laws that prohibit interference in federal or state elections, with House Democrats asking the FBI director to open a criminal investigation. To discuss, I'm joined by Seth Weathers, who previously served as the Georgia state director for the Trump campaign. Seth Weathers, the tape recording of President Trump berating and pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State to, quote, find votes, is quite damning, to say the least. Is there any other way of looking at it?
I think when you look at it from the perspective of the clips that were initially put out from the Washington Post, because initially the Washington Post only released approximately 4 minutes of very edited audio, and they wanted to be able to get their version of things across with that, and they intentionally did not release the full audio until the messaging had been set. But the reality is the conversation was, yes, was he upset? Was there some berating? Sure. But as to whether or not democracy was at stake or anything like that, it's not. If you listen to the full context, he's not asking the Secretary of State to just make up votes out of thin air. He's asking him to further investigate a litany of things that he had concerns with.
Hold on. He's not asking him to find votes, in other words, to make up votes. In the end, it all comes down to whether or not Trump knowingly and willfully pressured the Secretary of State, Raffensperger, to find enough votes to change the outcome of the election result in Georgia. The state, as you know, certified Biden's win by 11,779 votes. Trump, in his phone call, said, I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have because we have won the state. Is there any doubt that there was clear intent?
Understood. But if you listen to the full context of it, he had just given off a litany of items that he wanted investigations into certain counties where there's allegations about signature fraud on ballots, et cetera. And within that, he is saying that I don't even have to look at all of these items. If you will just look at a couple of these items, we'll find enough votes to make up the difference. But his point is it doesn't take a lot of these issues to make up for those votes because he believes there's fraud that took place.
Where is he going to find the votes? I mean, there has been more than one recount. There was an audit in the state as well.
Okay, so when they say
judges have thrown this case out of courts. I mean, clearly there have been investigations that have been conducted. In fact, as you know,
again, there's been multiple things that have not been done investigation-wise, and many of the claims, yes, I agree, they've been debunked. But whether they've been debunked or not, that does not go back to Trump threatening democracy because he wants them to do a signature audit in the largest county in the state of Georgia. That's quite different than saying he's trying to make up votes.
But wasn't he undermining democracy?
He's saying if you look, no, how does that undermine democracy? By checking ballots for voter fraud?
Well, some have even called it an attempt at extortion. The president was using the powers of his office to coerce a state official into committing election fraud to keep him in office and threatening him with criminal consequences if he fails to act.
We're jumping all over the board because I don't think neither of your issues pan pan out when we break it down.
You saw the
Again,
transcript
he's
of the
asking-
conversation, didn't you? He told him it would be a
I've read
costly mistake if he didn't
nothing.
go back and recalculate the vote.
He was making the point. He, at one point, said that he believed the Secretary of State knew that there was voter fraud that he did not want to address because he felt the Secretary of State thought it would look bad on himself. And his point was, if you go back and go through that, it will show enough votes were fraudulent, meaning you would, quote unquote, you could say, find enough votes for the state election here to be overturned in Trump's favor.
But all the president's assertions have been investigated, haven't they? They've been thrown out of court.
No, not all of them. To be fair, not all of them. Many of the ones I fully agree that he was referencing is based on faulty information that he has, the president, and they are inaccurate. However, not all of those items have been fully vetted. They're still waiting to be assigned a judge in the largest county in Georgia on one of the cases, which obviously they're just running out the clock by not assigning it to a judge and leaving it in limbo. They've still not done the signature audit of Fulton County, the largest county in the state of Georgia. So again, he's saying, if he's making the president was making the point, there was not a threat. He was making the point. If you know that there was fraud that took place and that's why you're refusing to do these further investigations, that would be criminal. And as the head of elections in the state of Georgia, if the Secretary of State did know that and did not pursue it, that would be a criminal offense. That is not a threat from the president. The president has no power or authority to launch any kind of criminal action against the Georgia Secretary of State.
But whatever these state officials have been saying is that whatever fraud might have taken place, it isn't widespread enough to change the result of the election. Let's face it, President Trump lost the election, didn't he? Even if a sizable part of the electorate voted for him. By denying that, aren't you disenfranchising the tens of millions of Americans who voted for Biden?
Again, I'm not denying that Biden won the election, but my point is here, the president is still, they're asking for specific investigations and further audits into ballots where they believe that there is fraud. Whether there is that fraud there or not, we won't know until those investigations are actually done, if they're ever done. However, yes, as it stands, Biden will be taking office on January 20th. I'm not disputing that. But again, the overall narrative of this story has been that there was threats and that democracy is under siege in America because of this stupid phone call. The phone call was not a threat. Democracy is safe in the U.S. And I think that it's been overblown by the American media. And they set the narrative, done well, and that's what's continued.
All right, Seth Weathers, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, though, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
With the president and his Republican allies still refusing to accept Joe Biden's victory more than 2 months after Election Day, Trump supporters descended on Washington, D.C. after the president repeatedly urged them to join the protests, which he promised, quote, will be wild. In the weeks since the November elections, several protests organized by Trump loyalists, white nationalists, and self-proclaimed militia members have turned violent. And now experts on far-right extremism are warning that the US Capitol could take center stage in violent confrontations between far-right protesters and left-leaning counter-demonstrators in the lead-up to the January 20th inauguration of Joe Biden as the 46th President of the United States. Joining me now to discuss the growing threat of violence is Heidi Beirich. She is co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. She's also former Director of Intelligence at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Heidi Beirich, you told the Washington Post recently that you're worried because Trump supporters are now a lot angrier, that they believe that Trump won the election and the country is somehow being stolen from them. But you also said that you're worried because you think they will bring guns to street fights. Washington, D.C., though, has strict gun laws. The police has been posting signs around the city prohibiting firearms. Does that make you any less concerned?
Unfortunately, the kinds of organizations and individuals who are upset about the outcome of the election, right, who believe that Trump won, as Trump appears to believe, these aren't people who are going to necessarily heed Washington, D.C.'s gun laws. And there are many people in the far right who have been arrested for various firearms violations over the years. And of course, they believe they have a God-given right to carry a weapon anywhere they want, of any kind that they want. So, my hope is that this doesn't happen, but I'm not sure that posting placards and signs is necessarily going to stop anybody.
Well, we know that the leader of the Proud Boys one of the groups that your former organization classified as a hate group, that the FBI has classified as an extremist group with ties to white nationalism, has been arrested. This group has been banned from Instagram, from Facebook, from Twitter, but they found more conservative social media outlets to spread their message. How much coordination is there among the different groups that are out there?
Well, the coordination is actually quite intense. So the Proud Boys can be found on places that are unregulated, like Parler and Gab. But they are also now sort of in league with other movements, like the racist Groyper movement, which is also found in those spaces. There are people on Telegram, another unregulated area, that interact with them. And then there are many, MAGA supporters, Trump supporters, who still have Facebook pages and Twitter accounts and interact with these folks. And the whole movement behind Stop the Steal, right? The idea that the election is being stolen. This is another faction that has become, loosely affiliated with all these groups. And I should say that when Enrique Tarrio was arrested, he was also found to have extended magazines with him. So it shows here's a person right from the Proud Boys who's coming to Washington, D.C. for a protest and apparently thinks he should be carrying weapons. And that's what I worry about in this case.
And when the President of the United States openly and actively incites these groups to stand by, urges them to hold these big protests in D.C., which is not exactly the most friendly environment for these groups, they know that they will encounter counter-protesters. How consequential is it?
Well, I put a lot of the blame for all of this happening at Trump's feet. He has encouraged white supremacists and other types of extremists. He has refused repeatedly to denounce white nationalism. He's tweeted out neo-Nazi accounts. I mean, look, the list could go on, right? Made horrible comments about immigrants, about Muslims, and so on. So he has sanctioned this kind of behavior. And by refusing to draw a bright line between himself and true extremists, he's also allowed conservative movements to bleed into white supremacist movements and mix and match in the way that we're seeing now. So we now have a really scary mix of everything from white supremacists and militias and conservatives all out there claiming the vote was rigged, which of course has been Trump's main point lately.
They're claiming the vote was rigged, but they're also planning these major protests in DC on January 17th and January 20th, Inauguration Day, calling it the Million Militia March. But when you consider the large number of Americans who still question the legitimacy of the election results, a recent poll showing that 83% of Republicans polled after the 2020 election say they didn't believe Joe Biden won. Another poll shows 39% of Americans believe that there is a deep state working to undermine President Trump. Are you surprised by the growing polarization and the fact that so many are becoming increasingly radicalized in the United States?
I'm not surprised at all. I mean, this has been the consequence of Trump's actions. And it's actually quite terrifying because all of the statistics you just showed are examples of how people are losing faith in democracy, right? They believe elections are a lie. They believe the system is somehow controlled by some secret cabal. They don't believe in our constitutional system. That's a frightening thing. I mean, you could continue. Half of Trump supporters believe in this crazy QAnon conspiracy, right? The Democrats are involved with pedophiles. This is like a poison that is leaching into the GOP. These crazy ideas used to be stuck at the fringes, and now, in the era of Trump, they have been mainstreamed, and they have changed our politics radically, and they've created a faction in this country that doesn't really believe in the system as it's laid out in the Constitution.
Heidi Beirich, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
And so with the President of the United States actively urging his supporters to gather in Washington, D.C. this week to pressure Congress to reject the 2020 election results, there are growing concerns over what could happen between now and Inauguration Day. That all living former secretaries of defense, including 2 who served under Trump, have felt the need to speak up and remind Americans about, quote, the unbroken record of peaceful transfers of power since 1789, speaks volumes about this moment in American history. That they had to remind Americans of the oath they swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, quote, foreign and domestic, and that they did not swear it to an individual or a party, shows the level of anxiety this moment is generating. with the former heads of the Pentagon appealing to political appointees, officers, civil servants, and the US military to be bound by oath, law, and precedent to facilitate the entry into office of the incoming administration, rather than trying to determine the outcome of a US election. And so, in short, the last-ditch attempt by Trump's staunch allies in Congress to overturn the outcome of a highly scrutinized election amounts to little more than political theater. It may be a move to appease Trump's diehard supporters, a tactical move ahead of the 2024 elections, maybe. But it could also alienate some of the 74 million Americans who voted for the Republican candidate, but who, like the rest of America, see this as a frivolous and yet dangerous attack on US democracy, which will only deepen the divisions and further complicate the politics and healing of the Republican Party. That's all from me, Rita Fakhri, wishing you all a safe and peaceful year ahead. From the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.